One of the names that you would certainly stumble upon when exploring contemporary Iranian history is Dr. Abbas Milani. He is a director of Iranian studies and adjunct professor at the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law at Stanford University. Dr. Milani is a researcher and author of numerous books and essays about Iran and Iranian history. His book on the Shah portrays a contentious biography of the monarch who shaped Iran's modern age. Professor Milani, if you could just please give us a little bit background story about yourself for our viewers.
Well, I was born in Tehran. I went to a small French school, co-educational. Those were possible in those days in Tehran. I came to the United States when I was 15 and a half. I got an undergraduate degree from Berkeley in economics and politics. I got involved in radical anti-Shah politics there, which was very much in vogue those days. I got my PhD from University of Hawaii in 1975. I went back to Iran, began teaching at what was then called the National University, is now Beheshti, and also Tehran University, Faculty of Law and Political Science. After about 2 years, I was arrested for anti-regime activities. I spent a year in prison. I was pardoned by the Shah when Jimmy Carter came. I was from the first wave of big pardons. I wasn't allowed to go back to the university because it was standard policy of Savak that if you have a leftist background, teaching is out of your fortune, which is interesting because all religious opponents of the Shah were allowed to go back to their jobs. Rafsanjani and Khamenei spent time in prison, were then allowed to start a school. And they were getting a lot more people involved in their narrative than us, a few, disgruntled university students or university professors. Anyway, after the revolution, I went back to Tehran University only. I stayed there till '87. And at that time, I again left Iran for reasons that I have explained in a memoir that I have written. I began to teach at a small liberal arts college called the Notre Dame de Namur University. I was the chair of the political science for 12 years. And for the last 15 years, I've been at Stanford, where I started the Iranian Studies program at Stanford, and where I also started with two colleagues what was called the Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institute.
Dr. Milani, if it's okay, I'm going to go into the story about the Shah and his illness and the revolution, and then we'll come back to,
Sure.
We'll go back to further history, and then we'll come back to today. When did the Shah realize he was sick?
The Shah realizes he was sick late in 1973. He is at vacation in the Persian Gulf, swimming apparently, and he touches his own belly and notices there is a growth. He thinks it's unusual, and they decide to call in after consulting with Alam, French physicians, and eventually Safavian. And I think at that time, gradually, they begin to realize that this is serious. I'm not sure in the early part he knew how serious it was. I think they decided not to tell him because he had a tendency to be a hypochondriac. He also has a tendency to be a man that was given to nervous anxieties. He was called in 1952 by one of the ambassadors as a Hamlet-like figure. So think of a Hamlet-like figure now being told as he's thinking that he's at the center of the world stage, running half of the world, that he has cancer. They decided not to tell him. They also decided, remarkably in my view, not to tell the Queen, who was the country's viceroy, was the mother of the person who would be king if he died. And she would be the ruling monarch if he passed away. And for almost 3 years they chose not to tell her, which tells you a great deal about the behind-the-scenes politics and thinking.
By they, do you mean Alam, Safavian, Dr. Bernard, Dr. Flandrin, and Dr. Ayadi, those five?
Those five. And the Shah himself. We can't exclude the Shah. Those people are the ones who gave him the advice, I think profoundly wrong advice, but the Shah concurred. If I put myself in his shoes, I would think the first person I would tell would be my wife. I know that the Queen likes to create a romantic image of their relationship. It was anything but romantic at that time. There's overwhelming evidence for it. But nevertheless, it was his wife. She was his wife. She was the Queen. She was the viceroy. She was the mother of the crown prince. And if anybody needed to know, if one person needed to know, it would have been her.
You mentioned 1973, the Shah feeling the lump in his spleen. We talked to Mr. Amir Hassan Afshar, and he had spoken with Dr. Fellinger, who was the Austrian doctor who saw the Shah earlier. He couldn't say for certain, and I'm just asking your opinion because he was just kind of going by what Dr. Fellinger told him, but he's saying that the Shah in 68, 69, when he was visiting Austria, he had been told by Dr. Fellinger, or at least Dr. Ayadi had been told by Fellinger, that the Shah has a lump here, he has some problems. They even took him to their cancer treatment centers. Do you think Ayadi knew and he didn't tell the Shah, or do you think the Shah had some kind of an idea of his illness? In 74, when they called Dr. Bernard, he wasn't just any doctor, he was the leading cancer specialist in the world, so he knew he had cancer. Do you think he might have known earlier, or maybe his people knew earlier?
I don't think so, but I don't know. What I don't know, I don't know. I don't know what the doctor told him. Ayadi doesn't come across to me as being a particularly astute physician. I never understood why he would be the Shah's trusted physician. His background was not even in medicine, he was a veterinarian. His training was certainly not very good. There are stories about how he might have cured Soraya of an illness, and that endeared him to the Shah. I don't know, but he was a very strange choice as a private physician to the king. And I have heard more often than once that the Shah really also didn't trust his physical, sort of physician's acumen. He would often make fun of him, in front of him and certainly behind him. So I don't know what Ayadi knew, but you know, there is a report, a very interesting report. It is around this time, end of 73, 74. I've quoted it extensively in the Shah book. Ambassador Zahedi meets with an American official. And the American official has some concerns that Zahedi jots down and sends to the Shah. And the Shah responds. It's one of those reports where Zahedi writes it with hand because he doesn't even trust his own secretary, and the Shah writes in his hand and returns. That's in the archive now. There, this high-ranking official, and again I've asked more than once from Zahedi, and he said, I don't remember who it is, and I believe him, because there are times I've asked him questions, and he says, I don't want to answer this. This is something I have promised, for example, the Shah not to divulge. So he's not one who would mince his words. If he doesn't want to tell you, he will tell you. So he doesn't remember it. But clearly somebody very high. One time he told me it might be Turner, then maybe head of CIA, or Kissinger, but I don't know. It's someone who's very obviously knowledgeable. And one of the questions he asked, and this is really the only evidence I've ever seen, the only concrete evidence that I've seen, that the Americans knew something was afoot. It says, we have heard that the Shah is sick. And the Shah on the margin says, nonsense, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fit as a fiddle. So I don't know what the Shah knew, but the evidence seems to indicate that he wasn't that worried. What makes the answer to your question complicated is that the Shah at the time thought, and he was right, that he was in a fight with the West on oil, that he was in a fight with the West on Iran's nuclear program. He was in a fight with the West on his now more independent foreign policy, and that if they knew he was weak and vulnerable, they might have gone after him in a different way. So he wanted to, I think, if he knew, he wanted to keep it a secret. So the answer in that letter is not necessarily indication that he absolutely didn't know. And since he never wrote an honest memoir after being deposed, wrote that rather profoundly insubstantial book, which is not an answer to history at all. It's a repetition of past, chosen histories. That would have been a place that we might have learned when he knew what he knew.
You had mentioned before that the Israelis may have known.
Mm-hmm.
We have heard that the French knew. They had told the British. So this was a miscalculation by him. Either way, hiding it. Mr. Zahedi says he should have gone to the people. The people would have supported him. In hindsight, I know it's easy now to say it, but do you think he should have told his people? Do you think he should have had it hidden, in spite of the battles he was having with the West? Do you think he would have garnered support for him at home in the long run?
I certainly think he should have told people. When you are as central to a political structure as the Shah was, he was the pivot of everything. Every decision, not just in the military, every decision in the country was virtually made by him. From appointments of governors to rectors of universities to any promotion in the military above the rank of a colonel. Some of the minutiae of Iranian politics had to be determined by the Shah. If you're that central of a figure and you don't think you're going to be around, if you trust at all your relationship with the people, you would tell them. I'm very surprised at this decision. But in one sense, I'm not, because I think, the Shah had a sense of hurt from the Iranian people from the time of Mossadegh. And I think that hurt was reignited and re-augmented after the revolution. That's why his memoir is so bitter.
You mentioned the Queen as being a regent. In 1974, he gives his will to the National Security Council and he declares her regent. Mr. Zahedi mentioned to me that that act by the Shah was never ratified by the Majlis. He had mentioned his own opposition to that. He said, I flew in and I told him, if you do this, I'm going to resign. Did that weigh in later in '79 with her and the continuation of government and with the amount of support that was given her with the Shah's potential illness? Do you think that had a factor later?
Well, clearly it had a factor in the sense that from that time on, she does become more powerful politically, and she does throw her weight around politically more. And this is not just in the last few months. Many of the royalists fault her as being the main reason for the revolution. I think they protest too much. I think she clearly had a role, and her advisors clearly had a role. That infamous speech was clearly the work of her coterie of friends, her relative, for whom I have a great deal of respect. the gentleman who ran radio and television, and Qutbi, is really one of the most respected technocrats of that generation. I've never seen anything bad praise of him. But he clearly misunderstood. Nasr clearly misunderstood the situation, I think. They misunderstood the nature of the moment. And I think the Shah made that speech because at that time he was absolutely dependent on the Queen for a lot of things. So in that sense, she is responsible. But if you go back from essentially after the 2,500 year celebrations, she is throwing her weight around more. She is talking more politics. The role that her influence had is, I think, different than the role that most of the royalists who are critical of her accuse her of. I think her support for Qanun Parvarish Fikri and the role that Qanun had a very profound impact in the propagation of a certain type of ideology in Iran. Some of it very good, some of it very much against what the regime was doing. You know, when you go back today and think about the Shah's last 10 years, to me the thing that is most remarkable is how confused they are. Everybody thinks they're confused in the last 10 months. No, they were confused in the last 10 years. Look at who the Shah's advisors and the Queen's advisors were in the last 10 years. Almost every one of them, someone who is profoundly anti-Western, profoundly anti-modernity, sometimes discreetly, sometimes not so discreetly anti-monarchy, at least flirting with the opposition. There are very few people who are in the inner, sanctum of the Shah or the Queen who really support what they are trying to do. The Shah was trying to modernize Iran on a Western model. He was trying to promote modernity. All his advisors are against modernity except Alam. The Queen is supposedly a modernist. She's trying to support modernism in art, and she does. She brings in, she does this remarkable Festival Shiraz. But who are the people around her? Shaigan. Shaigan writes Asya dar barabar Gharb, which is a kind of a harbinger of the revolution that is coming. Ashraf, her foundation has a journal in which Fardid, one of the most reactionary philosophers of the last century in Iran, a promoter of clerical despotism as the historical mandate of Iran. He's writing his anti-Western stuff. Go look at television. Look at what Naraghi and Meybudi and Fardid are saying on television in 1975-76 as the country is in this profound process of modernization. Who is defending your view of history? Who is making the point, a case, about why what you're doing is right? Unless somebody from the left came and supported the regime, or someone from the Jabheh, the Shah wasn't interested in articulating a point of view. I mean, it's just remarkable. They didn't write a single book describing how important Reza Shah was. They would actually tell people, don't praise Reza Shah too much in front of the Shah.
Where do you think this stemmed from?
It stemmed from the fact that, first of all, he had a complicated relationship with a domineering father, but also from the fact that he thought that he has done all this for the country and nobody appreciates him, and everybody talks about how great his father was. It's very difficult to be the son of a great father, and Reza Shah was a great man, and to be a son of that father, is very complicated. And Muhammad Reza Shah was not a very complicated soul. He was a very, in my view, he was a very damaged man. His relationship with his father, his loneliness, his relationship with his mother, with his sister, his choice of friends, all of this indicate to me that he was really a very fragile.
Talk about that personality, because on one end, he has this hyper-aggressive, totalitarian personality. On the other end, he's this shy guy that, you know, at the end when it comes down to taking decisions that a king has to do, he wavers and he doesn't do it. Talk about that dichotomy, how it affected him, how it affected our country with having somebody at the helm like that.
Yeah. You know, Shakespeare says that those who are pigeon-livered shouldn't roar like a lion, because they get the country into trouble. And if you read the Shah book, every chapter begins with a quote from Richard II, a Shakespeare play, about a character which is almost exactly like the Shah. He roared like a lion when he felt powerful, and was pigeon-livered when the first sign of danger appeared on the horizon. The Shah was, in my view, the perfect embodiment of what in political psychology we called authoritarian personality. The Shah didn't have a totalitarian streak. I disagree with you. The Shah didn't have a totalitarian streak. Khomeini had a totalitarian streak. He wanted to make everyone like him, like his own vision. The Shah didn't. The Shah allowed his sister to become a Catholic. Khomeini would have killed his sister if his sister had decided to become Catholic. The Shah, to his credit, allowed his other sister, his twin sister, to have a private life that was controversial. I'm not talking about her financial dealings. He should have stopped those. But he never tried to stop her manizing. She was the way the Shah was a womanizer, he was a manizer. She had many lovers. To his credit, he never stopped it. A totalitarian person would not have done that. The Shah was an authoritarian personality. An authoritarian personality, classically, is a bully when he feels powerful, and he's a bully with the weak. And he's submissive to the powerful, or he's submissive when he feels threatened. An authoritarian personality has a conspiracy mind. He thinks the world is full of conspiracies. Strange things are happening to get him. He had all of these characteristics. And when he was feeling powerful, he was acting like a very powerful authoritarian leader, telling America, don't, threaten us, we threaten you back. Then 3 years later, the same guy can't drink a glass of wine without first asking the permission of the American ambassador or the British ambassador. Somebody gave me a tape of an interview with the Shah. They have told me not to divulge it because they had some agreement not to. It's a journalist, two journalists who are interviewing him in Egypt. Or it might be Morocco, but it's soon after it's after he has left Iran. And they clearly don't know much about Iran, the two of them. I don't know how they got access, but they did. And they ask him, when this happened, why didn't you do this? And the Shah says, well, I asked the American ambassador, and he told me that we don't support this. The woman says, why did you ask the American ambassador? He said, well, we thought you were our allies. She says, yeah, I know you thought we were your allies, but you were the sovereign. Why did you need the American ambassador? And I think she honestly, earnestly thinks, why is a monarch asking the American ambassador whether he can make this decision? 5 years earlier, the Shah wouldn't have asked the American ambassador. 10 years earlier, the American ambassador goes to the Shah, not 10 years, 12 years, goes to the Shah and says, we don't think you should sign this agreement with Soviet Union. It is not in your interest, and we are going to be unhappy. The Shah says, be unhappy. We need this. We wanted to buy a steel mill from you. You didn't sell it to us. We buy it from anybody you want. Go fly a kite. That same guy 12 years later can't make the simplest decisions. Those are the dualities of authoritarian personality.
Following that into the 79 revolution, a lot of people blame Carter and the Americans for overthrowing the Shah, and I hear that wherever I go. But seeing what Carter was faced with, a sick king, the queen with her position, the valiat as the regent, the left, the military, the democratic movements, and the Soviets, he had to make do with what he had. Part of the understanding here I'd like to get from you is, at what point, I mean, we knew that the Americans actually wanted the Shah to get proactive and kind of quiet this disorder that was going on, but they found him incapable, and at one point they gave up on him. Please explain that. Was it, the conspiracy theories? I don't want to go there, but did they really want him gone, or did they just give up on him when they found out that he couldn't keep control and he was just kind of like a zombie there?
I have never seen a single document that tells me that in 1975 they wanted the Shah gone. They needed to have been idiots to think that they want the Shah gone. Israel should have been, many people think Israel was part of the conspiracy. Why in the hell would Israel in 1977 think any alternative in Iran other than the Shah would be more helpful to Israel? The Shah was in 75, 76 critical of aspects of Israel. He was critical of their occupation of the occupied territories, as he should have been. But it was the biggest ally Israel had. Why would Israel want?
You don't think that him removing his support for the Kurds, allowing the Soviets to supply Sadat in the Yom Kippur War, you don't think those had a factor in it? I'm not saying so. I'm just saying playing the devil's advocate.
Of course, no. You should play the devil's advocate. Of course, he had disagreements. First of all, on the issue of the Kurds, it was the Israelis that, with the help of the Shah, convinced the Americans and the British to come in. By 75, the Shah decided that was no longer in his favor. I haven't looked at the Israeli archives, but I have talked to Israeli ambassador to Iran, both of them, and they both thought that they were surprised. But to think that your surprise or your dismay at the Shah's sudden decision to end your joint efforts to destabilize Iraq is now enough for you to get rid of him and risk bringing in something like Khomeini, to me, requires a level of idiocy in Israeli foreign policy that I have never found there. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, generally, and I think those who are looking for a culprit, whether it's Carter, the British, the Masons, the Zionists, are all trying to absolve themselves of the guilt. We are all guilty for what has happened. We are all responsible for what has happened. Individuals for not doing anything or doing something, opposition figure for opposing the Shah without really duly thinking about what might come later, people around the Shah for being psychopaths, for not telling him the truth, Hoveyda for not standing up to him when he created a party that was clearly against the Constitution, and every one of these people who are now sitting and looking for a conspiracy, the Carter conspiracy, a Zionist conspiracy if in 1975 they had stood up to the Shah and said, this decision is illegal. We're not going to become the first secretary of this party. He would have fired Hoveda. Amouzegar said the same thing. He would have fired Amouzegar. The third person, he would have had to rethink the option. None of them stood up to the Shah. Occasionally some people did, from Mehdi Sami to Zahedi in some of the things, to the Queen in some of the other things, but all of these were done discreetly in the back. If all of this had happened, even assume that Carter wanted to have this conspiracy. If you're looking for a culprit, American culprit, much more guilty, or at least as guilty as Jimmy Carter, is Nixon. And almost as guilty is Kennedy. Kennedy pushes the Shah to undertake changes without really thinking through what the consequences are. You can't change a society like Iran. You can't help end feudalism like Iran and not think that that new society is going to require a new political structure. The Americans in '62 thought that they can force the Shah to gradually become a constitutional monarch. By the time those changes were taking most root, Iran was having a middle class. There was a massive migration to the city. This is a big event. This is, as one British document says, this is the most profound change in Iran in 2,000 years. A feudal society has now become an urban society. Iran in early 20th century is 90% countryside. By 1975, it's at best 50-50, 60-40. This process has, in Europe, taken 300 years. In Iran, it's done in 20 years. What have you done to absorb this change? The Americans thought that they would pressure the Shah to bring about the kinds of changes that would allow this accommodation to occur. But then Nixon comes to power. There is Vietnam. There is the stagflation, the economic crisis of the US. And Nixon, with Kissinger, decide, hell with the pressure for democratization, hell with pressuring the Shah not to buy as much arms. They issue that famous telegram, the carte blanche telegram, give him what he wants and leave him alone. And then 10 years, less than 10 years later, 7 years later, American policy changes again. Now they want the Shah to democratize again. And now they want him to democratize when the economy is diving, when the Shah is sick. Did any American policymaker think through all of these changes? You can't change your policy on a country that is as volatile as Iran. In 15 years, 3 times, 3 major paradigmatic changes in US foreign policy from the time of Kennedy to the time of Jimmy Carter. This doesn't mean Carter wasn't responsible in some way. Carter made a lot of mistakes, in spite of his maybe best of intentions. He made a lot of mistakes.
I'd still like to talk about a little bit before we move on about the status of power in the final days. You mentioned it wasn't just the 10 months, it was the 10 years before that that saw the Queen, actually from 74, the Queen get involved more. In those final days, we heard that, I haven't gotten concrete proof, but, talking to Mr. Zahedi and Mr. Afshar and those people close to the Shah, that his medication, the chlorambucil, was mislabeled. And for, who knows, maybe up to a year, he was taking the wrong medicine. And at the end, probably around 76, 77, he was in really bad health. Nobody ever found out who who changed that. They blamed his valet. But at that point, I'm assuming the Queen and her staff is making the decisions. How much of the decision making with putting Hoveyda and the head of Savak in prison, how much of that was the Queen and her entourage? How little was the Shah in control those last days? How do we know that tide, when this timeline happens?
We don't. We don't know the exact timeline. But again, it is a little too simple to say that that's what caused all the trouble. Kim Roosevelt, a famous Roosevelt, comes to Iran in 1974. And as always, he goes visits with the Shah. He's a dear friend of the Shah. And he's making a lot of money through contracts that the Shah helps him get. He comes back to the United States, writes a report. That report is in the Shah book. And he says, the Shah doesn't want to talk about domestic issues in Iran. He says, everyone I talk to, they tell me, if you can convince him that the country needs some decision making, he's thinking about the international scene. By then, he thought of himself as a global leader. And in some ways, he was a global leader. He was a global leader, not in some sense. He was a pivotal figure in that period. But pivotal figure in the international domain doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to what was happening domestically. And what was happening domestically was that the society wasn't going in turmoil. I came back in 75 from having not lived in Iran in 11 years. Two things became almost immediately obvious to me. One, this can't go on. Two, what we said as the opposition was almost all highly exaggerated and irrelevant to the realities of Iran. But you didn't need to be a genius to figure that things needed attention. When the Queen began to make some of these decisions, I think it's very difficult to say. I can't say it. I know some people feel confident to declare. I don't. No.
The 1979 revolution. Explain to us the lack of understanding that people had before the revolution, before the Constitution, before the referendum about the Velayat al-Faqih. We went into, as you mentioned, there was everybody wanted the Shah replaced, but there was no understanding what was to come afterwards, and how that ignorance, that lack of understanding, led to political Islam taking that vacuum, for all the other people that followed. Talk about that, please.
Well, I think there are two things you have to remember. One is Khomeini, in the month before the revolution, hid the fact that he was hoping to create Velayat al-Faqih. In Paris, in the last few weeks in Najaf, he never once mentioned the word Velayat al-Faqih. Not once. He talks about creating a democratic future in Iran. He repeatedly says the clerics won't have any role to play. So one reason is that he hid his intention.
But I'm sorry, I just wanted that point because before we go on, didn't the West, didn't they know his books, didn't know his teachings? They had history with him in the 1960s with Kennedy and with him. They knew what he stood for. He wasn't like a complete enigma that came out of nowhere.
Well, they didn't know his book, first of all. Certainly, you're talking about Iran. We don't know what the intelligence agencies knew. Some of it we know because some of it has not been declassified. And the intelligence agencies, the documents I have seen, never saw political Islam, as you call it, as a threat, because they never thought these guys are serious about seizing power. They thought they were just a nuisance. So one aspect of why people of Iran didn't know was because Khomeini didn't tell them in the month before. Second, the book was banned in Iran. The book was actually banned in Iran. Khomeini's books were banned in Iran. I would have made them mandatory reading. I would have taught them in classes. I would have discussed them on television instead of bringing Fardid and have him spew his anti-Western gibberish. I would have had somebody come and talk about the book in a most polite, reasonable manner. Say, this is what this guy wants. This is what he says. He says, I don't care for your vote. I am your ruler whether you want it or not. They banned the book. That's the second reason. The third most important reason, I think, and I know the royalists don't like this, They keep pushing back, they keep calling me nasty names, but the Shah helped create the Islamic Revolution by destroying all opposition except the religious. The number of mosques built in the last 15 years in the Shah period, it's in the book. It's staggering. It is the Shah who builds a mosque at Tehran University. Reza Shah didn't. It is the Shah who appoints Nasr as the rector, as the rector of the most important technological university in Iran. And you know what Nasr does? One of the first things that Nasr does at Danishgah Sharif, Arya Mehr, he brings two people to set up an Islamic Guidance Center at Sharif Arya Mehr University. You know who these people are? Haddad Adel wa Pur Javadi.
I didn't know that.
Yes. The only people who were allowed to organize, the only people who could publish their magazine without Savak's censorship were religious people. Khamenei has translated 4 books by Sayyid Qutb, the most important theorist of radical political Islam, as you call it. An Egyptian, the theorist of Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, 3.5. He translated the 4th, then he was exiled. He had his brother, he's semi-literate, finished the translation. He himself is a good translator. These books are the most radical rejection of everything that the Shah's regime stood for. They were selling in thousands. Savak didn't even know these books were being published. I asked Parviz Sabiti, the most informed political intelligence officer of that era. I said, did you know these books were being published at that time? He said, no, we weren't that interested in them. They allowed this network to create. Who other than religious forces had the ability to create a national network? Not just mosques, schools, هیئت، انجمن بزرگداشت تولد امام زمان. I don't think your age would allow you to remember. When I went back to Iran in 75, on the day, the first year that there was a تولد امام زمان, I was absolutely blown away by how big the celebration was. تنها پادشاه عادل سلطان ما. I said, somebody is organizing this. Who is organizing this? They thought, Savak thought, the religious forces, so much the better. Because our danger is the left. To fight the left, they nurtured the Islamists. Not Khomeini, they exiled him. Not Nawab Safavi, they executed him because he was a terrorist. But everybody else was allowed to create schools, hayat, masjid, jalse Quran. And yet, 40 years after the revolution, we still don't have a single serious book about how that network worked. How did they organize it? Savak isn't interested to talk about it. Royalists aren't interested to talk about it. The left isn't interested to talk about it. And the religious forces boast about aspects of it, but have yet to describe. Everybody says it was the green theory by Berzhinsky. What the hell does Berzhinsky know about Iran?
Do you think part of the Shah's faith in the clergy stems back from 1953 and the eventual support he got from the clergy and Ayatollah Kashani in coming to power? Did you think that that's where it rose from?
I think that clearly augmented it, but it didn't arise from there. One of the first things the Shah does is send Rahnama to Najaf to bring back Ayatollah Qumi, who has left in protest of Reza Shah, when Reza Shah unveiled women forcefully. Qumi came to Tehran to meet with Reza Shah. Reza Shah said, I won't meet. He said, if you don't meet, I'll go to exile. He said, go. The Shah brings him back, from Najaf, and makes promises to him. Read the memoirs of religious forces. They say, the minute Qumi was brought back, we knew there was a new game in town. And they began to organize. And they began to mobilize.
Why did the Shah leave Iran? What was his intention when he left? We've heard many things, from him running away to him leaving and instructing the military to do some things which didn't happen, to coming to the U.S. to talk to the Security Council and Congress. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but why would you think the Shah left at the time he did, such a critical juncture?
Because he was a weak character and always left. Everybody likes to blame Sullivan. The Shah likes to blame Sullivan, saying he kept looking at his watch. You're the monarch of the country. Throw the bastard out of your room. What do you mean the ambassador looked at his watch? I decided to leave the country? No. He left every time there was pressure. He almost left in 1941 with his father. He almost left in 1946. He threatened to leave in 1949. He almost left in 1951-52. He certainly left in 1953. He almost left before 1953 if the Americans and Kashani and the Zahidis and the Ja'faris hadn't come to the court. The Shah would have left then, end of 52. He almost left in 61. So the notion that the Shah left because the Americans told him to leave ignores a very long history. The Shah wasn't a fighter. The Shah was an authoritarian personality. When he felt good, he felt strong. At the first sign, he left. What would have happened in 53 if the Shah hadn't left on the 16th? Look at the documents from the CIA, recently declassified documents. They almost all say if the Shah hadn't left, Mossadegh might not have won the day. What if he had stayed in Kalardasht? He didn't have cancer then. Sullivan wasn't the ambassador then. I say all of these not as a criticism of the Shah's 7-year rule. The Shah did a lot of wonderful things for Iran. But he's also responsible for the Islamic Revolution. He's also responsible for leaving the country prematurely. He's also responsible for breaking the Constitution. He's also responsible for Hizb al-Astaghis. But he's also responsible for one of the fastest periods of growth in Iran's history. He's also should be credited for putting the country on the path to becoming absolutely on par with South Korea today. I absolutely praise him for that and bow my head to that. But I can't say I like that part. But these other parts, they're all British conspiracy.
One of the more enigmatic characters that nobody really talks about or knows is General Fardust. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know very little about him, and I try to talk to as many people as I can. Can you shed a little light on this character for us?
I've written about Fardust. Yeah, I've written a whole chapter in Persians about him.
I read that chapter.
He is very much an enigma, but he fits the model of conspiracy buffs who want to find one person. Yeah. He's the Rasputin of the Iranian Revolution. Was he a suspicious character? Absolutely. In 1954, the Shah, or might be end of 53, Zahedi knows the date better than I do, but I've heard it from him. They get a report. General Zahedi gets a report that says Fardust has been in contact with the Foreign Intelligence Agency. They take it to the Shah. The Shah looks at it, gets very angry. He says, "You can't even see me having one friend?" Tears it, throws it in the garbage.
I want to go back a little bit, and you brought up a very important point of the Shah's relationship to his father.
Just one?
I'm sorry.
I'm
One of the points.
joking.
One of the points I want to go, because that's very little talked about. It is a lack, the lack of understanding for Reza Khan, Reza Shah, his abdication, World War I, World War II, and the relationship of the Shah with his father. Why was Reza Shah removed? Was it really that his because again, two sides of it. One is, okay, he was colluding with the Germans and the influence, and what was going on with the war and the fear of the British and the Russians. The other says kind of they British really didn't want him out. He was just kind of unpopular at the time with what he had done. It was a very oppressive government. There was a lot of corruption back then. There was very lack of freedom of the press. There was lack of freedom for traveling. We didn't have a mail system. I mean, these are all the critiques of him. That it was just the situation has become untenable, whereas he couldn't keep control. What was the real situation with Reza Shah abdicating, and what was the story behind that?
Well, Reza Shah's abdication was clearly masterminded by the British. My sense is that they weren't necessarily thinking about him abdicating when he did. They wanted to punish him. There's no doubt about that. I have seen far too many documents, and I've talked to Anne Lambton, who wrote some of the most vitriolic attacks on Reza Shah on BBC Radio. Reza Shah had defied the British. Reza Shah had stood up to the British. I know, again, the common lore of Iranian historiography about him is that he was a British puppet. The British might have helped, certainly did help to bring him to power, but he was no British puppet. I know Mossadegh and his supporters like to claim that he built the railroad on the order of the British. Absolutely false. Absolutely false. There is at least 1,000 pages of documents that show the British were against the idea of building a railroad first, and when he decided that he wanted to build it, they were against the idea of a north-south railroad. They wanted an east-west. They did everything they could. I don't think he should have built the railroad the way he did. There should have been experts. He decided himself. But the idea that the British told him is simply silly. He stood up to them on the case of their puppet in Khuzestan. He arrested them, or Zahedi arrested them and brought them to Tehran. He wouldn't allow the British ambassador to go visit the guy. Literally. And the British Consul General goes, then the Oriental office goes. They reject him. The ambassador goes, and then he comes to Reza Shah and says, "We can't see our guy?" Reza Shah says, "Yeah, you can't see our guy. This is my country, our country, we have laws. You want to go see him? File a report. I'll make sure you get to see him." This goes all the way to 1939, where he says, "You owe us money, we want money." The British say we are involved in a war. Reza Shah says, "It's not my war. My country, I need to industrialize." At that time, Bullard writes, says, he keeps stepping on the lion's tail. The lion will one day bite. Well, it bit in 1941. And they began attacking him, and Reza Shah, I think, hoping to save the crown for his son. Because again, we know the British were toying with the idea of bringing in a republic, bringing back the Qajars.
Yes.
And Reza Shah, I think, decided that abdicating. But then the British went out of their way to humiliate him.
After Reza Shah left, I've seen, I saw a New York Times article from 1941 that says there was $55 million of his wealth confiscated in London, in England. And there's reports that at that time he had $200 million worth of wealth. Do we know how much he had, or are these kind of what the British did to discredit him? Is that part of it? Because
those were certainly part of it, because they also broadcast those on Iranian radio.
yeah.
And when Reza Shah went, the Iranian government actually wrote a letter, these are all in the Shah book, to the British. Say, you have claimed that he has $55 million. Could you tell us where it is? We want to confiscate. They said, well, that was war propaganda. But he did have, having said that, there is no doubt that he had money outside Iran, although the royal family at the time said he didn't. I have absolute evidence that they transferred at least $1 million from a European bank to an American bank. This is all documented. And he had a lot of money in Iran. I mean, if Reza Shah didn't have his financial corruption, and he was financially corrupt, he would go down in history as one of the greatest reformers, I think, of all time. He still will go down as a great reformer, because he took a bankrupt country on the verge of absolute collapse, and out of it, with iron fist, he made a modern nation.
Explain that to us. We seem to have a lack of understanding of where Iran was in the 20th century. Explain to us, after the Constitutional Revolution, decimation of World War I, where we really were when Reza Shah had to abdicate. He couldn't leave the country. He had to leave part of it through Iraq because we didn't have the railroad going all the way to the south at that time. Explain the situation of where we were, the reality of the backwardsness of the country that we were experiencing.
Nothing captures this than this statistic. Between 1900 to 1920, Iran lost minimally 25% of its population, and maybe 40%. The reason we don't know is because we don't have a clear number. But if you take the lowest number, 25%, to hunger, cholera, Spanish flu, war, that's a remarkable number in 20 years. And it was in today's political science term, there's something called the failed state. Somalia is a failed state, where there are warlords, there's no central authority. Iran in 1920 was a virtual failed state. There was a little monarch called Ahmad Shah, but he was far more interested in gambling in Europe and collecting his monthly stipend from the British, which he did, about which he bickered, than ruling Iran. The country was on the verge of absolute collapse. The British in 1919 were on the verge of absolute turning Iran into a virtual colony. That's the country that Reza Shah had. A lot of Iranian Democrats in 1919, 1920, Malek Shuarai Bahar, Ghazvini, many said, we need someone to come and take care of this country. Reza Shah, in a sense, was that hoped for iron fist. First with the help of Said Zia, one of those remarkable characters, but then himself. So he took that country that didn't have an army, that didn't have a central government, that didn't have a bureaucracy, that didn't have a judiciary, that didn't have an education system, that had lost 25% of its population, and gave Iran in 1941 to his son, that had a central government, that had an army, it wasn't a very efficient army, that had a bureaucracy, it had its corruption, but it was a working. It had a judiciary that was on par with any judiciary in the third world, more secular than most Muslim countries. But he also had a sticky hand. 40%. This is not according to the British. This is according to the Iranian government. 40% of all monies, naqdinegi, all the printed money in Iran, at that time was in his private accounts. That's a lot of money. He owned 2,000 villages, some of the most beautiful, rich villages. He bought them all He didn't confiscate, but he bought them at discounted prices.
Let's continue with World War One. You mentioned the failed state government with Iran, with foreign control. Why do we know so little about this period? And I know the British War Office records are locked up for another 100 and some odd years. When they released World War II, we still haven't gotten that. And the Russian stuff a lot of it hasn't been translated. Why is there so little internal information from domestic sources about that?
Because we don't know much of our history. It isn't just World War I. What do we know about almost any period? What do we know about some of the most important events that have happened in the last 100 years of our history? If there is now a new generation of Iranian scholars inside Iran and outside Iran who are really trying to look into all of this stuff and find some of this. But there is so much we don't know. And there's so much we don't know about our own culture, about our own history. You know, Farhang Mehr just died.
Yeah.
And they invited me to speak at his memorial yesterday. So I came in the morning, returned late at night. And one of the things I talked about, I said, how little do we know about the role that Zoroastrianism has had in the world history? There is no other religion that has had a more profound impact on Abrahamic religions than Zoroastrianism. Almost every major idea that Abrahamic religions have has come from Zoroastrianism, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Without Zoroastrianism, these religions are unimaginable. How much do you know? How much do I know about the role that this faith has had in the development of... We have just left our culture to either be studied by others who haven't necessarily had an impartial view, or we just haven't studied. And World War I, World War II, how many books do you know about Said Zia? Said Zia is one of the most colorful characters, one of the most interesting characters, one of the most honest politicians. He's pro-British. That's what everybody knows about him. There are a million other things about him that we don't know. When he left Iran as a prime minister, he virtually had 25,000 Tuman with him. He became a rug dealer in Montreux 2 weeks after being a prime minister of Iran. And then he comes back with all kinds of fascinating ideas. We have reduced them to the enemy of Mossadegh and the agent of the British. He was an enemy of Mossadegh, was a critic of Mossadegh. He was certainly an ally of the British, if not their agent. But there's a lot more about this man. Qavam, Bakhtiyar. Oh, what do we know about Taimur Bakhtiyar? What do we know about Zahedi? Father or son? What a caricature do we have of them? To me, I was absolutely ashamed of myself. I truly was. How the image I had of Zahedi was a caricature of this man. And now that I look at the documents, I see how much there was there to see, and we just didn't see it because it's easier to be happy with simple-minded solutions. Complexity for a lot of people begets anxiety. And of course, complexity might also beget our own responsibility.
We do tend to paint everything with a broad stroke, which I want to take it back to 1953, Mossadegh.
Mm-hmm.
This is a period in our history where a lot has been written, but very little is actually known. Mm-hmm. I want you to take us back and make us understand what would bring a country, a nation, to a point where you have all the opposing forces that have been, with the military, with the intelligentsia, with the king, with the democratic forces, with the Tudeh, with the left, and the prime minister. That whole clash there, it was kind of a microcosm of everything was going on. All the players were there. What were the dynamics of that period? And we hear a lot of things about Mossadegh was democratically elected, and he wasn't, he was appointed, and the legality of the whole situation at the end, where it came down to can the Shah dismiss him when there's no parliament, and he's dismissed the parliament. Can you take us from the broad part of it with all these forces fighting to the detail of what the legality of what that was? And in your opinion, was that a coup? Was that a revolution? Was it nationalist forces? Was it foreign forces? Or all of the above?
Well, first of all, Mossadegh was as democratically elected as his predecessors. The General Razmara was elected in exactly the same way as Mossadegh was. At that time, Iran was a constitutional monarchy. The Shah didn't have the right to appoint a prime minister. The Shah appointed those that the parliament gave a vote of confidence to. Mossadegh got a vote of confidence the same way Razmara got a vote of confidence. So to say that Mossadegh was democratically elected, it sort of confuses the issue. Mossadegh was more popular than Razmara, certainly, but democracy doesn't have necessarily much to do with the popularity of the character. Trump is democratically elected, but he ain't popular. He lost by 3 million votes. Mossadegh was appointed in the same democratic manner than Razmara was. That's why it is absolutely shameful for Iranian Democrats to condone, for example, the assassination of Razmara. For Mossadegh supporters in the parliament to condone the assassination of Razmara. The aspect of the events around Mossadegh that I think hasn't been much studied is that the coalition that actually brought Mossadegh to power is the coalition that overthrew the Shah later. That's the interesting part. The radical Islamists, from Fadoyan Islam to Jabheh to Tudeh, after Siatir, they formed a coalition. That's the coalition that overthrew the Shah. Once that coalition broke, Mossadegh was gone. That coalition is now broken. That's why this regime can't last. It won't last. Mossadegh writes a letter to the Shah in 1949. I've quoted the letter in the book. Yeah. He says to the Shah, in fact, he says to the court minister to tell the Shah, to be precise, he says, tell His Majesty that when there is no parliament, you have the right to appoint a prime minister. Appoint the prime minister you like instead of this idiot. 3 years later, Mossadegh can't say, I now have changed my mind, because he can't fire me. You can't say an order is illegal because it was delivered at 10 o'clock instead of 5 o'clock. What kind of illegality is this? The Shah's order, in my understanding, and according to the understanding of Mossadegh himself in 1949, of every advisor to Mossadegh in 1953, was legal. Mossadegh just miscalculated. Mossadegh thought the Shah went there. In Bache, he called them, went there. Well, the Bache dared. He dared because the Americans helped him there. He helped because the British helped him there. He dared because Zahedi and his group helped him there. But to say that that was an illegal order, to me, doesn't make sense. In the court, Mossadegh says, I didn't accept it because, first of all, it was delivered late. Second of all, I didn't see any reason why His Majesty would fire me. You're not the person that decides whether someone who has the power to fire you has the right to fire you. They do have the right to fire you. There might be bad firing. And if you look at the document, when the American ambassador comes back on, it's the Hafta Mordad, 17th of August, and goes to see Mossadegh directly from the airport. And there's a memorandum of that conversation. And he asks Mossadegh, what happened? And Mossadegh sort of gives his version of event, that there was a coup attempt, and it was thwarted. And the ambassador says, but wasn't there an order of dismissal? He said, yes, there was, but I had for some time come to the conclusion that the Shah doesn't have the right to issue this kind of order. The ambassador says, would you repeat that? I want to make sure I got this down. And Mossadegh repeats it. And the ambassador says, this indicates that it's Mossadegh who's organizing the coup, because he is not accepting a legal order. The Shah, when there is no parliament, has the right to dismiss the prime minister. Sadiqi tells him that. Sadiqi actually tells him the number of times such an order had been issued before, since the constitution. And Mossadegh had served in a cabinet, thus appointed. So, if you read this new batch of documents that was just released, 1,000 pages, they're all there.
The security archives or the
National
Security Archives?
Well, some of it are from National Security Archives. This is sort of a compendium to the 1989 volume, Foreign Relations of the U.S.
Okay.
And that one was so bad in omitting some of the most important documents that the Congress of the United States ordered the State Department to go back and issue a new volume. This is a new volume. It has 1,000 pages. Still, a few very important documents are not there. Very important CIA reports are not there because they claim it's lost or something. But the bulk of it is there. And it's a remarkable image. Exactly as some of us have been saying, the most important factor was Kashani's switching side. And Kashani switched side very drastically.
When did he take sides? Because we know the original mission with the British and the Americans, and that didn't go well. And there was a lull. And then Kashani and the clerical forces. At what time was that, between the 15th?
The Kashani change was much earlier. You're talking about 15th of August
to the
19th.
Yeah.
No, by then Kashani is long gone.
Talk about that. What caused the original movement to not succeed, and what caused originally the momentum?
After Siatir, after Mossadegh resigns, Mossadegh goes and asks for the role of the commander-in-chief. The Shah says, no, I'm not going to give it to you, that's my right. Mossadegh says, I'll resign, thinking that the Shah will back down. The Shah doesn't back down. Mossadegh resigns, and from the next day, demonstrations begin, every day increasing till the Shah is forced to act a change. Now, again, if you want to know the character of the Shah, read the reports we now have of how the Shah behaved after Mossadegh's resignation. He was secretly negotiating with the National Front against Qawam al-Saltaneh because he didn't trust Qawam al-Saltaneh. He didn't give Qawam al-Saltaneh what Qawam al-Saltaneh needed to establish law and order. He told Jabhat Milli that I'm not going to use the military against you. So they knew that the Shah was not backing the government down. So on the one hand, he forced the hand of Mossadegh to resign. On the other hand, he completely made it impossible for Qawam to continue. After Mossadegh came back, Kashani began to demand his share of the spoils. Mossadegh wouldn't give it. Kashani wanted the Baha'is thrown out of offices. Mossadegh said, no, they're citizens of Iran. He wanted veiling. He wanted his son chosen as a representative. On almost every issue, Mossadegh said no. And Kashani clearly sensed that Mossadegh was beginning to become too close to Fatemi and Hizb ut-Tahrir. So he begins negotiating with the court and with the Americans. He meets with the American ambassador. He meets with the head of the CIA in Iran. All of this are in these reports. It is remarkable. He sends messages to the Americans and the British that we need to find a way to get rid of this guy being Mossadegh. And the minute that happens, Mossadegh is deemed to be vulnerable in the eyes of the Americans and the British. But while the Americans and the British are doing this thing, there are people opposed to Mossadegh inside Iran who are also planning. I mean, Zahedi wasn't in the beginning on the pay of the British when he began to try to overthrow Mossadegh. Zahedi was an ally of Mossadegh, was in his camp, he helped elect some of these people. So it's simple to say a national uprising or a coup, Qiyam Milli, a coup d'etat in Nangin, it ain't any of those things alone. It's a combination of a tragic history. And we haven't paid enough attention. We haven't tried to understand it in its complexity. Our left, our Mossadeghis, are still enamored of a book written by an American journalist who doesn't read Persian. How the hell can you write the history of 28 Mordad and not read Persian? Could I write the history of the assassination of Kennedy without writing English? They would laugh at me. But Iranian leftists and Iranian National Front supporters have gone gaga over this book because it confirms their version of history. He's a good journalist, but he knows virtually nothing about that period except the CIA reports he's read.
Another factor that caused confusion for me personally, especially in the 80s, I was much younger and I knew less about what was going on, is when Madeleine Albright came and apologized to the government of Iran for the overthrow of Mossadegh, which, knowing what you're talking about and the role of Ayatollah Khamenei and the clergy, and it makes no sense. How do you explain that? I mean,
I don't. I wrote an article at the time. I said, first of all, you're apologizing to the wrong government. Yeah. These are the people who overthrew Mossadegh. But the apology was also very carefully worded. It didn't say we overthrew him. It says our role in the overthrow. And they did have a role. I mean, there's no doubt that they had a role.
But what was the point of accentuating that role at that time? What was the point of it?
The point was that there were some people who wanted to mediate between U.S. and Iran, wanted to normalize relations, and convince the Clinton administration that if they make that apology, Khamenei will change. I would have absolutely, first of all, told them that it's the wrong group to make an apology to. Second of all, that's not going to do it. Khamenei's anti-Americanism, you can find the clues in those books I was talking to you about. It has very little to do with anything else post-revolution. But because I want to be fair to both sides, part of the reason your generation didn't know the complexities is because the Shah and his regime would also allow the complexity of the issue to be discussed. They painted Mossadegh as this demonic idiot, and they painted the 28 Mordad as this glorious day. They didn't allow a discussion of the complexities of the issue. Mossadegh was not a demonic idiot. Mossadegh was a nationalist, but was a nationalist who made profound mistakes. That's the discussion we should have had. Not the discussion that Mossadegh Khaim bud, he drank alcohol with Tudeh, the kind of stuff that the Shah insisted on having, because he hated Mossadegh, and he hated Mossadegh for what Mossadegh had done to him, which was a lot of bad things, incidentally.
We tend to have heroes or villains in our histories,
exactly,
without having just people doing right and wrong.
Yeah. We tend to operate in the black and white of history. History is always in the gray zone of humanity.
I want to bring it a little bit into the kind of the current period. How were the January 18th demonstrations, and to some point the 2009 demonstrations in Iran, how are they similar and dissimilar with 1979 movements in Iran, with the type of people getting involved, with their motivations, with the apparatus, what was that situation?
I think that the January ones are closer to a similar structure, although even that is not similar, and I'll tell you why I don't think it's similar. But both of them are interesting because they indicate the breakdown of that coalition that brought the Shah to power. And it was a coalition that was going to break. It was a coalition that had begun to break almost immediately. But with every passing day, another part of the coalition falls off. The January is very important because it now indicates that the poor, the unemployed, the urban marginalized, which were historically what this regime claimed to represent, the Mustazafan, are now sick and tired of the regime. Or a great number of them are sick and tired of the regime. I think still the regime has maybe 10 million supporters, but almost everybody else is opposed to the regime. And that demonstration is the beginning, in my view, of the end for this regime, because they are rooted in the profoundest economic challenges that this regime has. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was not the result of an economic collapse. The revolution began at a time where Iran was having one of its most rapid economic developments. But when you have rapid economic development, followed by a sudden change of politics, followed by a sudden downturn of the economic fortunes, followed by a sudden change in American foreign policy, followed by a sudden change in the health of the person who's pivotal to the whole thing, you get a 1979 revolution. The 2009 was a much different phenomenon, but also related. Different phenomenon because it was essentially an urban, intelligentsia, middle class phenomenon. This one was a much more poor movement. But 2009 was connected to 1979 in the sense that 1979, in my view, was a democratic revolution that was abducted, that was changed, transformed, whatever you want to call it, to what it became. People didn't overthrow the Shah to bring back a person 10 times more empowered than the Constitution, 10 times more despotically empowered than the Shah ever was. The idea was to create a more democratic Iran. So 2009, people were basically asking, what happened to our democratic rights? Khomeini made that coalition by promising people democratic rights to the intelligentsia, to the democratic forces, and money and free electricity and free home to the downtrodden. In January, the downtrodden says, we didn't get our share, we are unemployed, despairing, no hope on the horizon. 2009, the democratic forces said, what happened to our vote? We were supposed to have a democratic society. And the saga continues and will continue.
It is continuing. And what do you see in the future for the Islamic Republic, at least the Velayat Faqih, the current system as it stands?
To me, the Velayat Faqih is a dead institution. It might survive Khomeini by the force of the IRGC for a while, but I don't think it's going to survive because it doesn't have solution to Iran's enormous problem. Iran faces economic challenges that are monumental, from water to end of the era of oil, to a population that is aging, to a banking system that is absolutely on the verge of collapse, to a society that has now 10% of its entire population outside Iran, the diaspora, to a society that has 110 million SIM cards for a population of 85 million, that has 40 million Telegram users. Misbah Yazdi and Khamenei and Velayat Faqih do not represent the society. And sooner or later, reality establishes itself over these kinds of quixotic claims to power.
You mentioned before part of what caused the upheaval in Iran, at least as far as the foreign policy was concerned, was the vast difference between Kennedy and Nixon in 62 and 73. Well, we just saw something very similar to that between President Obama and President Trump. This bipolar American foreign policy has resurfaced again. First of all, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, how that's affected things. And then also talk about the JCPOA, President Obama's approach of negotiations, rapprochement, peaceful change, islahat. Do you agree with this approach, that it could have change in Iran, it could cause positive change in Iran?
Change in Iran will come and should come from within Iran. It is not the business of the United States to force changes in Iran. It is absolutely not in the business of the United States to determine what the future of Iran will be.
But whether we want to or not, the U.S. is involved. Like in 2009, while that movement was going on, the U.S. shut off the airwaves, and President Obama came and said, "I want my hand is out here for Ahmadinejad to shake." That caused the downfall of that movement to a great deal.
No, that didn't cause the downfall of that movement.
With the suppression too.
The suppression caused the downfall, and the mistakes of the leadership caused the downfall. If Mousavi, for example, had opted for a more militant confrontation, we might have had a different outcome. Obama should be criticized, absolutely. And I have criticized him in the past for not supporting that movement more full-heartedly. But today, about Trump, the same thing holds true in my view. I'm very happy that Donald Trump supported the Iranian movement. But I'm not happy that he seems to think, that he can decide who the next regime in Iran should be. The U.S. should say, again, I've written this, that's why I'm telling you this. Yes. I think I'm very happy that the President of the United States says, you people in Iran, if you kill your people, we're watching, and we're going to use the power of the United States to prosecute you. The fact that they threw Shah out of Germany when he was sick was not completely unrelated to the new atmosphere. That we might go after you. We might take you to court. Now, people like Shahrudi, Raisi, Khamenei, all of these guys will think twice before they come anywhere outside Russia, Syria, Lebanon, and maybe Iraq. So I'm very happy for that. But it should come with the humility of recognizing that the future of Iran, it should be in the hands, and will be, I think, in the hands of the Iranians alone. The U.S. can help. I am all for the United States right now making it absolutely possible for Iranians to have access to internet and break the monopoly of the regime on social media. To me, that would be a very, very profoundly impactful decision, and I'm all for it.
Why was it that President Obama decided, to negotiate with this government? And the Israelis were going to bomb Iran at that time. They were very serious about it. The nuclear, still the chance is there, but at that time, it was either war or trying to make peace. Knowing that, and knowing in hindsight that all the money that went to Iran, it didn't get spent in Iran, and it caused expansion of Iran in the Middle East. Do you think that was a mistake? Knowing what he knew.
The JPAC?
Yeah,
No,
knowing
I don't
what
think
he knew.
It was a mistake. I think I thought JPAC was the least bad deal they could make.
Yeah.
I was very much for it. But I was for it with this caveat that I think they missed a great opportunity to also solve a couple of other issues. One, human rights. Two, the regional role of Iran. They decided to not do that because some people in Washington, some maybe lobbyists for the regime, told the Obama administration that if you raise those issues, Khamenei will walk. And Obama really wanted that deal, and I think that it was a serious deal in the sense that it is the most substantial rollback of a nuclear program outside South Africa and Ukraine. For Iran, it was a profoundly bad deal. Iran had spent hundreds of billions of dollars on developing an infrastructure that they now had to essentially mothball. Nobody paid any price for it. Khamenei was never called to question. Why did you put the country on this path? Now, under pressure, you have to throw in the towel. But Khamenei did it because his back was to the wall. They should have included human rights. Absolutely.
We talk about a democratic Iran, a democratic solution in Iran. In one of your articles, you wrote, "Don't oversimplify the protests in Iran." You analyze the spectrum. What, domestically and also from foreign support, what path do you see forward for a democratic Iran? We know as much as President putting pressure, that pressure could be a little bit too much, and it could cause war and breakup of Iran. Where is the fine balance that you find that pushing them to the verge of causing change, but you also don't want another war and devastation and going backwards. What is that path that you see to democratization?
Well, I have been trying to figure out what the Trump administration's policy is, and I haven't been very successful. I think they go from one extreme to another. It basically depends what Mr. Trump feels like in the morning on his Twitter. And that doesn't make a policy. The idea of, for example, banking Saudi Arabia and the new prince to solve the problems of the region, to me, is faulty. Saudi Arabia faces serious problems, including Yemen. Yemen is a shame. And Saudi Arabia is not going to win. And Saudi Arabia is spending hundreds of billions, with the US spending tens of billions. And Iran is basically thwarting all of that effort with a few million. And is playing right into the hands of the Iranian conservatives. So to me, a wrong US policy would not only possibly dismember Iran, but it would help consolidate the hands of the conservatives. The rhetoric against JPAC, walking away unilaterally from JPAC, only helps Europeans, helps Russia, helps China, helps Khamenei. The thing that nobody talks about these days, in my view, that is far more important than almost anything else, is that within Iran there is a fight between Khamenei and some of his allies who want to repivot Iran towards China and Russia, and the rest of the country that doesn't want that repivot. If the Khameneis of Iran win, if Russia and China increase their influence on Iran, that's a major strategic change with profound long-term impact. Much more important than what happens to Khamenei's cancer. That's what the US needs to think about. The Iranian financial system is on the verge of collapse. The only country that has the money to spare, the authoritarian structure to spare, is China. And China is apparently making the offer to come in.
They're doing it.
Well, they need to do it a lot more. They need to spend maybe several $100 billion. But do we want Iran to become a colony of China like some of the African countries? And if they do, what does that do to the long-term balance of forces between China and the United States? China is in the middle of one of the greatest rebuilding of a military in history. They're not doing this just to show it off on May Day. What is China's long-term view of the world? And to me, the most important thing for me is, what is China's long-term game in Iran? And what is in the interest of Iran? Is it in the interest of Iran to become a virtual colony of China? I say absolutely not.
But Iran fits in very prominently in the One Belt, One Roadway plan of China. That's a very linchpin point of that whole
Absolutely.
thing is right there.
Iran could be a part of that and benefit from it. Iran could be a part of that and become a virtual colony of China. Those are two different things. If Iran was an independent country, not desperate for the Chinese infusion of money to keep the financial system afloat, Iran could make a good deal. As Iran could make great investments, for example, to increase its gas production and export to Europe. But Iran, Khamenei, who doesn't want to become a challenger to Putin, is absolutely not interested. The ways that Iran is paying for the follies of Khamenei are profoundly saddening. We will be paying for these reckless gambles for many generations, I think.
Do you believe that a change in regime can be possible without regime change? Do you believe in islahat or reform within the system? I mean, some people refer to the 25 million votes that Rouhani got as votes against the status quo. But is that really votes against the status quo when you know the history of Rouhani and how center he is to the status quo, and now he's become the reformist? And I understand the slight difference that you're talking about within this government, there's people that want to steer it away from Chinese and Russian domination. Is that nuance enough to justify supporting these two splits within this government, or do you think the solution lies something completely outside, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Well, first of all, it's not important what I want, it's important what the people of Iran want. And I think clearly what the people of Iran want is to have a change of regime without a regime change. And in my view, incidentally, they have had some remarkable success. Look at the women's movement. This regime, in its model, was very much similar to Taliban in terms of what it wanted to do with women. Stay at home. If you come out, wear your veil, don't work, produce babies. But what is the reality of Iranian women today? The reality of Iranian women today is that instead of the 9-year-old that they want a woman to get married, they marry at 24. Instead of the 12 children they want, they have 1.7 children, 1.9 children. Instead of staying at home, they now are 60% of college graduates. Instead of having an affair with their husband only, they have an average of 3 affairs before they get out of high school. They have changed this society. Politics, contrary to what our generation thought, isn't just grabbing power at the top. That's part of politics. Politics is also about what happens on a daily life. Politics is about what happens between a man and a woman when they go into their home, in the bedroom, attending the baby, who washes the dishes, who has the right to walk out of the house or walk out of the relationship, who has the right to walk out into the streets freely, sit in a cafe with whoever they want. When I lived in Iran in 1986, if you were caught with a woman in a cafe who wasn't your wife or daughter or your sister, there could be hell to play. Now people do it all the time because on a massive level they have decided to defy the government. So is that going to be enough to get rid of the regime? To have a regime change in that sense? I'm not sure. But is it changing politics? Yes. Is that enough? I'm not sure.
I hear what you're saying, again, playing the devil's advocate. Not
Please.
that this isn't necessarily my point of view, but we've heard this throughout the last 38 years of the Islamic Republic, where they have moderates come, they have Khatami comes, and then Ahmadinejad and Rouhani here and there. But in the end, this is all different parts of the same apparatus. And the main question is velayat faqih, as long as that system of government is there with that constitution. And do you believe any of these reformists are really interested in changing the velayat faqih? Because people like Rouhani and Khatami and Musavi and Karoubi, they're clerics. They're not interested in getting rid of Sharia law or velayat faqih. So to what percent is it justifiable for us to put our trust in these movements rather than something outside of the regime? Because the regime apparently understands this desire of the people not to have a revolution of devastation of the country and going into war. It's kind of a catch-22 here. They know it, and are we being played, or do you think this is real authentic change by these men like Musavi and Karoubi and the people who are responsible for creating the Islamic Republic?
People could be played, absolutely. But first of all, that's not just true in Iran. It's an old discussion in political theory in terms of whether genuine change is allowed, for example, in a democracy because it's democratic or because it's clever, and it allows these minor changes as a way to abort a revolution. Marcuse, the 1960 radical thinker, developed a concept. It's called repressive tolerance. It says capitalism allows a certain level of tolerance in order to repress the real resistance. So we might be played. The Iranian people might be played in this case. But look at Iran today. In 1988, Raisi, who might be the next Vali Faqih, and 3 other criminals like him, went into prisons, and within 3 months, literally killed about 4,000 people. Do you think that's possible in Iran today?
Depending on the situation.
I don't think it's possible. Look at how many political prisoners they have. Look at the way they don't want. They still kill they killed 4 political prisoners in the last 4 months. So I know the brutality is there. I don't think the regime has changed its brutality. But when you have 55 million people with smartphones registering every time a Labas Shakhsi beats a woman and put it on the internet with millions of Telegram users, it changes a little bit. Is it enough change? I don't know. Are we being played? I think that's very possible. But I trust the Iranian people better than anyone in Los Angeles or Washington to decide what is good for the Iranian people. If they think they're not being played, I trust them.
Even considering what the Iranian people have endured for all these years?
Of course,
at the hands of foreigners.
If they have endured all of that, that makes them much more wise about all of this. You and I, who have sit in Palo Alto and Los Angeles and haven't endured much, aren't good judges of what is being played and what is playing the opposition. I honestly mean, I'm not being falsely humble. I trust them more than I trust anybody else. It doesn't mean that I have blind trust in the will of the people. But when I see that how they're trying to play the system and how they forced it to change.
Let's talk about the role of the U.S. in Iran. Starting from Amir Kabir, bringing them in there, and up until 1953, and then the role of how that changed from 1953 until now. And do you think there's a way for the U.S. to go back to being that white knight that it's been for Iran? Do you think there's a way for that position to be reestablished?
I think the days of white knights in Iran are gone. I think the Iranian society has reached a level of maturity that they don't expect Imam Zaman or white knights or red knights or military booted knights. They are their own savior. And that's a profound change. If I am right, and I think I am, but if I'm right, that's a remarkable change of almost epochal consequences. A society that has been told for 1,000 years that what you do is basically insignificant, wait for the return of Imam Zaman. And then for the last 100 years, that concept was taken by the Iranian left or the Iranian right to say, wait for the Tudeh party to come and save you. Wait for the general to come and save you. Wait for Soviet Union to come and save you. Wait for America to come and save you. No. Wait for Arash to come and save you. No. We are the Arash. Beizai has a brilliant play called Arash. It's a replay of the Arash Kamangir mythology. In Arash, he comes and saves Iran, kills himself and saves Iran. I'm sure you know the story. Puts all of his soul in the bow and it goes far and Iran is expanded. Beizai says, no, that ain't this case. That's not how we save Iran. We are the Arash. This generation in Iran today ain't looking for white knights. And they shouldn't. Iran has the capacity of becoming a remarkably powerful nation in the Middle East and in the region because it has the capital, human capital, it has the financial possibility, if it has a wise leadership. Unless they do it themselves, they're not going to. Those in Washington or Los Angeles or Chicago who think America is their white knight, they're missing the boat.
The unity you're talking about, the national Iranian identity. First of all, I want to put this in two parts. Talk about 1935 and what were the circumstances of Reza Shah changing Persia to Iran, the name, and how that transforms into the national identity today, and how Iran is a lot of different people with a lot of different languages, with forces pulling on them, the Kurdish, the Arabs, the Baluchis, there's a million forces. What is our hope for uniting that? What is that national identity for the future?
Again, I think that's a very good question. I think for 100 years, there is a battle between Islamists and secularists to define what that identity is. And they generally tend to have gone extremes. Reza Shah thought he could make an identity bereft of any Islam. Khamenei and his cohorts think they can make an Iranian identity bereft of Zoroastrianism and pre-Islamic era. It doesn't work. Iran is a complicated, long, 3,000-year epic history. It stays because it is an epic history. It has withstood the Mongols, it has withstood Alexander, it will certainly withstand Khamenei and Khomeini. The dangers are there, but if you look at history, the odds are it will survive. It will survive because it has something that is unifying. It has a culture. It's not the language, it's a culture. It's the sense of belonging to this place that is rather unique. And if we try to create an identity that says we have no Islamic Islam in us, or to say we have no Zoroastrianism in us, no Mithraism in us, it's not going to work. We are a combination of all of this. Sa'di and Hafiz, Rumi and Ferdowsi are remarkable poets. I'm working on an article on Sa'di.
On Sa'di?
Yeah. And I'm a big fan of Shakespeare. Sa'di is really comparable to Shakespeare in the depth of his understanding of the human condition and the beauty of his prose and the beauty of his poetry. What other country has a poetry that Iran has? I mean, I'm humbled by this culture every day. I truly am. I'm not being, tarifing. I'm not being hyperbolic. The more I understand Iran, the more I'm humbled by all that it has had. And when I say humbled, I don't mean that I don't know its darker moments. I know what the Safavid did to Iranian Sunnis. I know what Qajar did to Kerman. All of these things we know. We have read. If you read a little bit of history, you know that.
I want to get into the psyche of the Shah a little bit. And we know that conspiracies cause political paralysis in Iranians. Mm-hmm. And, even at the end, we're taking all these Valiums. How did that paranoia help us understand that for him to come and want to change the world order that put him in power in such a short period of time? It's this concept that I keep having with Iranians. There's this black or white. Shah was a great guy. He loved Iran. He fought for his people. And the other people, the opposing side. Well, in the end, I guess a judge of a monarch is how effective he was for his people, not his intention. Mm-hmm. Help us get a little understanding of his psyche and how it led to his downfall and his failure.
Edmund Burke, one of the conservative thinkers, says the measure of a politician is not the changes he makes, is the enduring changes he makes. If the changes you make die after you leave, you ain't that great. But I think Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah are, in fact, in that sense, the authors of enduring changes, because the modern Iran that will emerge from this nightmare is to no small measure the result of their help. But the Shah was profoundly paranoid. And the paranoia came partly out of his own weak character, but also of his experience. Imagine his relationship with this all-powerful father, taller than him, overpowering, brute. The British destroy him, literally turn him into a little thing and constantly make him squeamish. And then in 1942, they send a message to the Shah through the ambassador of Britain in Egypt. Okay? The text of the message is in the book. I have you can look at the document if you tomorrow go at the Green Library. They say, look what we did to your daddy. We can do this to you. A weak, vacillating young man who has just seen his icon of power shattered is now being told by the British, we'll do this to you if you don't behave. He keeps getting these reminders, that strengthen his paranoia. And sometimes his paranoia is actually right. On Azerbaijan, Iran is trying to get rid of Pishavari. The Shah is trying to organize with the Americans and with Iranian nationalists a way to get rid of this. But he keeps telling the Americans, I don't think the British are with us. And the British weren't. Actually, now that you look at the documents, they weren't. They didn't want Iran to take the case to the UN because they thought that if Iran takes Azerbaijan to UN, somebody might take Khuzestan to UN. Yeah. So, Nabokov has a brilliant short story. He says, what if the paranoid is right? Somebody's after him. The paranoid was partially right. Sometimes they were out to get him. Almost everything the British told about the Shah, Reza Shah, they knew it was exaggeration. They were playing. The Shah knew all of this. So it kept, if you look at these documents about 52, 53, he doesn't believe anybody. He believes the the British are with Mossadegh, occasionally believes the Americans are with Mossadegh. You know, when he comes across a character like Ebtihaj, Walatana Ebtihaj, a brilliant financier, he keeps asking the Americans and the British, is this guy an American guy? Is this guy a British guy? The idea that Ebtihaj is a nationalist just, seems to him difficult to conceive.
The Shah, whether it was voluntary or forced by the Americans or, Carter or Kennedy, do you think he could have made that orderly transition to a democratic constitutional monarchy? Just like people are wanting to put Velayat al-Faqih to be more democratic, and they don't understand the whole concept of it. Do you think he could have done that?
When he discovers he's sick, his first inclination is to actually try to create an institution for that possibility. He calls Sami'i in, Mehdi Sami'i, and they have these long negotiations. He tells Sami'i, who is one of the most respected, impeccably credentialed technocrats, bureaucrats, head of the central bank, the head of Sazman Barnameh, London educated, impeccably honest. He says, go create a political party. He says, these political parties ain't working. Go create a party of your type. And Sami, I've seen the minutes of their conversations with the Shah. These conversations go on for 6 months. You see both the tendency to want to do it and the fear of maybe losing control. And then he suddenly changes his mind. The price of oil goes up. He pulls the plug on this and creates Hizb al-Astaghis.
And now we're in the Me Too movement in the U.S. and the women empowerment. And having talked to some of the people who could have supported the Queen more, Mr. Zaidi is one of them. He said there was no precedence of an Islamic country with a female monarch. I didn't think she could contain power. How does that come into effect of there was no transition of power because there was no real support with her? How much of that support was because of her cadre and what she was doing, and how much of it was just the fact that a female monarch had no precedence, and it was hard to get all those people that supported the Shah to put their support behind her as a woman?
Well, first of all, in Iran, which isn't just the Islamic country, there is a precedent for a female monarch.
Before Islam?
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm talking about Islamic country.
Iran is not Islamic only.
Yeah, true.
Iran is Iran. Long before anybody else had a queen,
of course,
we had
yeah,
our queen.
Yeah.
So the notion that this was absolutely unacceptable to Iran, I'm not sure is correct. And I'm not sure, I appreciate that Mr. Zahedi articulated his view, but I don't agree with that view. I think at that time it would have been a step forward. And if they had managed it better, it might have worked. The idea that we've never had it, and she wasn't going to be a monarch, she was going to be a regent. But having said that, the Shah, who made her the regent, wasn't willing to accept, to allow her to try. She tells him. It's in her memoir.
She wanted to stay when he left.
She says, maybe you're the problem. Essentially, that's what she says. Maybe you're the problem. Maybe I can solve it. Why don't you go? You remember what he says? He said, don't play Jeanne d'Arc for me.
Yeah.
The Shah, having made all these wonderful changes about women, if he was around today, the Me Too movement would have gotten him. And he occasionally has some really remarkable misogynist things he says with Alam. That woman can't think.
And the interview with Barbara Walters, where he specifically said that about the Queen with her present. I was just shocked looking at her face. Well,
and that you haven't even produced a good chef.
Yes. Do you what is your opinion about his son? Do you think he's got what it takes to come to power someday?
That's up to the Iranian people to decide. But I prefer not to talk about that.
I appreciate that. While at Stanford, we were also fortunate to visit the Hoover Institute, home to Ardashir Zahidi's archives, a collection of the former Iranian diplomat's writings, speeches, and correspondence about Iranian foreign relations. It includes rare photos and papers of Zahidi's father, Fazlullah Zahidi, who was a prime minister of Iran from 1953 to 1955.